Well, I think we're broadcasting. I don't know. It says live. So I'm here with William Hitchcock, who is a professor of history in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. And he's the author of The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s. Now, I have to confess a couple of things. Number one, William Hitchcock is a good friend of mine. So let's get that out on the table. or he was a good friend before this interview, at any rate. Number two, I have read drafts of this book, and I think it's really terrific. So this is not about critiquing the book. I've already given Will my comments. He's used some not so much. This is really about learning about Eisenhower and learning about how one goes about writing such an outstanding book. So welcome to BookStory, Will.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be virtually with you. I'm just sorry I didn't wear my backstory t-shirt.
Well, most people actually prefer to be virtually with me, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, so some of our viewers, listeners, YouTubers, live streamers, not quite sure what the noun is. Some of our fans or our club members are not really that familiar with Eisenhower. So I thought you might start, Will, by giving us a brief outline of Eisenhower's life and career.
Oh, yeah. I'd love to. It's really, I think, an extraordinarily American life in some ways, and of course, a remarkable life, an exceptional life in others. Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas. So he was the last American president to have been born in the 19th century. And of course, he lived through the jet age and the missile age. So it's an interesting arc that when he was born in 1890, what America was like versus what it was like when he died in 1969. He was born in a very poor family. His parents were sort of itinerant laborers, basically, in Denison, Texas. And right after he was born, they moved back to the family town of Abilene, Kansas, where his ancestors had moved in the middle or earlier part of the 19th century. So Eisenhower grew up in a town that was familiar to not just himself, but to his parents and his grandparents. They were poor. As Ike said, we were poor, but the great thing about America was that we didn't know it. And that sounds kind of corny, but Ike used that line again and again to describe his very humble origins, because for him, as you might imagine, I mean, he was a political guy. He knew that had a lot of political value. He genuinely believed in the old adage that if a shoeless, penniless kid from Abilene, Kansas could grow up to become not only Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe in World War II, but President of the United States, America must be a special place. And I think actually he's right about that. So one of the key things—
I'm just going to stop you right there, Will, because some people, most Americans of that generation would not deny that, but some people would say, well, I must be a special guy to have done that. And are you saying that Eisenhower really did credit a big part of his success to just this country and our system of governance?
I do. I do say that because he said that. Now, whether or not that's the only, of course, what makes Eisenhower extraordinary is that he was not limited by his circumstances, the circumstances in which he was born. He was a smart, ambitious, energetic young man, and he knew enough that he knew that he wanted to get out of Abilene. And, he was 20 years old when he finally figured out, well, I've got to get out of Abilene. The only way that I can really get out of here is by going to college. And he didn't have 2 nickels. So where did he turn to get a college education for free? The American military. So he applied to West Point, was accepted, off he goes into a career of military service. So, you know, he had to find some mechanism that could pull him out of his very ordinary circumstances with no influential patrons to help him out. And the military proved to be that, as it has been for many, many Americans over many generations.
Yes. Would, if you want to continue, just tell us a bit about Eisenhower's rise with the military and eventually his ascent, his political ascent to the presidency.
Sure. Well, he, you know, it's a rather, he enters into at West Point, the class of 1915. That is, he starts in 1911, graduates in 1915. Right. Now, the class of 1915 goes down in history as the class the stars fell on, because so many graduates of that class would go on to become general officers of the U.S. Army, because, of course, 1915 is on the cusp of the First and then the Second World War. So naturally, all of those young men would go on to have, many cases, distinguished military careers. I think it was 59 men in that class became general officers, and 2 of them became 5-star generals. Now, we've only had 5 5-star generals in our entire history, and 2 of them were in Eisenhower's class. He was one of them, and his classmate, Omar Bradley, was another. So it is a remarkable moment in American history, American military history. This class and these men are on the threshold of the American century. The United States is about to expand its military to become a global power, and they're going to carry these guys into fame and fortune, or at least give them the opportunity to show themselves. So Eisenhower gets lucky. It's odd to say that he's lucky because war breaks out and America spends the first half of the century fighting, but it gives him opportunities that he never would have had before. The main thing about Ike to realize is that he doesn't win his influence by becoming a great combat general. People like Douglas MacArthur, he would become one of the most decorated First World War officers of his generation. Ike missed the combat in the war, but he did gain a lot of experience by training men, by commanding men in training units back in the States. Most important, Eisenhower had a gift for getting noticed. And a lot of powerful generals around Eisenhower kept pulling him out of obscurity and bringing him into more and more important positions.
And what do you attribute that gift for getting noticed to?
I think that in the environment in which Eisenhower operated as a young military officer, there were plenty of men who wanted to demonstrate that they had guts and courage. There were not so many men who stood out as intellectuals. And one of the things that I learned working on Eisenhower is one of the central things that surprised me about this guy was that he was unbelievably intelligent. And this cuts against the grain of every portrait you've ever heard of Eisenhower as being a dummy, a golf-playing ninny, a guy who just sort of bumbled his way through life. I think his IQ was off the charts. As an organizer, as a man who could solve huge logistical tasks efficiently, as a guy who made his bosses look good. Eisenhower was outstanding. So Douglas MacArthur hires him. You know, General Pershing, who organized the First World War, the Expeditionary Force, he hires him at one point. And of course, most important, it's George C. Marshall that notices Eisenhower, and in 1941 brings him into his staff in Washington and says, Eisenhower, I hear you're a great desk officer, a great staff officer, a great logistical planner, and you've also got a lot of political skill, a lot of talent. You're a nice man. You get along well with other people. You can build coalitions. And of course, Marshall sends Eisenhower to London in 1942 to be the leader of the Allied coalition that's being built in London. It's an astonishing risk, actually, because here's a guy who's never fired a gun in battle. But Marshall sees his skills, his personal skills, his talent as a leader, as a coalition builder, someone willing to share credit, someone willing to deflect the honors onto other people. All of those skills that good leaders in organizations naturally have. Ike had them.
Now, look, I mean, we both know that it takes a lot of political savvy to succeed in the military or any large organization. But the kinds of skills needed to get elected to office are usually considered to be quite different. So, was Eisenhower a reluctant politician in the, running for office partisan sense, or did he always have that skill and had carefully hidden it from everybody else?
Eisenhower went through a period of private and public hemming and hawing about whether he wanted to become a politician. In 1950 and 51, a lot of his friends said, Eisenhower, you have to rescue America from the legacy of the Roosevelt-Truman administration. It's been 20 years. The Democrats have run everything. They've been in charge of they've created the New Deal and the Fair Deal. The government has gotten too big. The budget deficit's ballooning. Labor relations are terrible. Our war in Korea is going badly. The Democrats have mucked it up, and only you can save us. And Eisenhower's response to this kind of thing initially was, I'm a career soldier. Not only do I not think I'm really the man for the job, but it would be a betrayal of my career as a nonpartisan military officer to step into the political arena. But of course, as many people who knew Ike well could see, he was very ambitious. And the opportunity to be president and to show that he could do a job that Harry Truman, for example, seemed not to be doing very well was very appealing. So the idea of becoming a politician was hard for him in one sense, but it also was natural for him in another sense, because he was ambitious. He had been a political figure in the war in Europe, managing this global coalition. He finally, after he leaves the army in 1947 and then before he becomes president in 1952, is a period of self-discovery where he's learning, what are my beliefs? What are my politics? Where do I fit in the political landscape? And these are questions that he never would have asked himself as a military officer, but he has about 4 years to figure out, what are my beliefs? And he discovers he's a very conservative Republican. More so, actually, more conservative in before he's president than the way he actually governs. And that's an interesting transition. But he maps on to certain conservative ideologies about small government, a kind of libertarian sense that the New Deal was absolutely wrong and un-American, and that individual initiative is what made America great, and that needed to be encouraged. So that's who Herbert Hoover really is, who he's most aligned with intellectually as he's thinking about running for president.
Wow. So when he decides to run, I think you talk about, if I recall correctly, that he was recruited by both parties. That's something that's a little hard to imagine today. Perhaps you could talk about that.
Well, he was recruited by both parties, but that's because he had everything going for him. He's a above party figure. Spent his life in the military, so he doesn't owe any party anything. He's the face of victory over Nazi totalitarianism. I mean, if that's at the top of your resume, you're already halfway to the White House. He had a terrific personality. He was, and this is something we have certainly forgotten, but is absolutely true, he was a charisma machine. He was a...
Wait a second, Will. Wait a second there. I know that our viewers are sitting there looking at a picture of this old, bald-headed fuddy-duddy. A charisma machine? Make that case to me, Will.
I will. I'll tell you that I looked into this again and again and again. And the thing about Ike we ought to remember is that as a young man, he was a world-class athlete. Eisenhower was, of course, he played football at Army until he wrecked his knee, and then he coached the junior varsity team. But he was also almost went pro as a baseball player. He was 5'10" and a half. He weighed about 175 pounds. He was always physically fit. And what everybody says about Eisenhower was that he was incredibly active. He paced the room. He had enormous hands. Whenever he shook your hand, he would crush it into a little, like a walnut. He was seen as enormously strong.
Did he let go of your hand at the right time?
He didn't have the Trump move down quite. But all I'm saying is that he was much more physically dynamic in real life than he appears to be in black and white photographs, when he seems to be old and ill and so forth. And countless stories have been told about how his very reddish complexion was very distinctive. He had these piercing blue eyes, and of course, he just carried with him an air of command, which you would do after being a five-star general. So people, it's a classic case of, we walked into a room, everyone swiveled and said, "Oh my goodness, there he is." He had star power. Now, again, this is sort of hard to translate, but this is what his contemporaries have told us again and again. So he had it all. And in 1952, it's no wonder that the Democrats in the late 40s were hoping that he might be a Democrat. And Harry Truman said, "Come on, I'll get you the nomination, no problem." But he had no idea that Ike was, in fact, a conservative Republican.
Let's talk a little bit about his presidency. Will, what do you think the one or two toughest decisions that Ike had to make were?
Well, I think one of the first and really hard decisions that he had to make, most of the decisions, well, I'll give you one from foreign policy and one from domestic policy. When Eisenhower became president, the Cold War was not cold at all in Asia.
Right.
And there was a very real possibility that a third world war would break out, and it would happen not in Europe, which was relatively stable, but it would happen in Asia. The Korean War was already going on. The war in Vietnam or Indochina was also ongoing, and that was France's colonial war. And Communist China had just taken power in 1949 and was threatening to invade Taiwan, where the Chinese nationalists had gone to seek refuge and to establish an alternative China. So there's three theaters of war essentially going on in Asia: Korea, Indochina, and Taiwan. And those three were burning red hot. There was not a Cold War there. They were absolutely, Americans were fighting and dying in Korea when I came into office. So I think overall, one of his hardest or earliest decisions was to figure out how to make that hot war stay contained. And he agreed against the advice of a lot of people in his own party to cut an armistice deal in Korea. If a Democrat had done that, it would have been called appeasement. Right. Ike calls it sort of half a loaf. He says Americans don't want this war, and he cuts a deal. And as we know, that armistice has lasted, for better or for worse, for 70 years. So I think it was a gutsy call, but he got a lot of grief from his own party for the agreement in essentially accepting anything less than victory. He also manages to stay out of the war in Vietnam, which also, I think, showed a lot of sense in 1954. So 53, 54, his handling of the Asian crises, I think, is really quite remarkable.
And I'm going to stop you there because we had a question from a BookStory member, Michael Vinos, who was very surprised as he made his way through your book. He was very surprised about the rather loose discussion of the possible use of nuclear weapons. And so he asks, he wants to know, how likely is it that Eisenhower would have authorized the use of nuclear weapons if the Korean conflict had dragged on?
Well, I was quite surprised to find that Eisenhower had what I would call a very unsentimental view of nuclear weapons, which is kind of a horrible thing to say, because he became president less than 10 years after the use of the atomic bombs by the United States against Japan. But I think it's because he had experienced the Second World War up close and had made so many terrible decisions about using force against civilian targets. Remember what America did to West Germany during the last year or two of the Second World War, killed hundreds of thousands, maybe 600, 700,000 German civilians in bombing West Germany in order to win the war. His view was that if war should come in Asia or anywhere else, in Russia, it would be immoral to leave on the sideline a weapon that might shorten such a conflict, and to pursue a conflict through conventional means that might lead to the deaths of many, many Americans, as well as many other soldiers from the other side, as well as many civilians. So his view was, nuclear weapons are here. They are horrible. We hope they are never to be used. But if it comes to making the choice to use a nuclear weapon in order to shorten or end a war, he would have done it in a heartbeat. And I'm not saying he's right about this. I think that was a cold-blooded way of viewing things. But Eisenhower was a cold-blooded man in many respects. And in his view of nuclear weapons, he was chillingly prepared to unleash American power in a way that I think is still shocking to us today, because, of course, who knows what the consequences of such an action might have been.
And why do you think that he didn't use nuclear weapons, given that he did preside over a hot war? Americans and Koreans, of course, were dying. What constrained him?
Well, in the case of Korea, he did have a pretty elaborate contingency plan, which was being drawn up in the first few weeks of his administration, to widen the war in Korea. He sought to end the Korean War one way or another. And his first instinct was to increase the pace of operations, to have more soldiers, more air power, and indeed to use, targeted atomic weapons against key sites.
Like tactical nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah, key sites in China, especially, where the Chinese were mobilizing their troops and sending in their air power and so on. So he was prepared to expand the war. Why didn't he do it? In part because what we know now is the other side decided they preferred an armistice, not because they were afraid of atomic weapons, but because Stalin, the Soviet leader, he died in March of 1953, and immediately the Soviet Union's successive leadership said, we want to get out of this war. It's a mess. We're not winning anything here. So they put pressure on the Chinese, who put pressure on the North Koreans to cut a deal. So the war came to an end in part because the other side wanted a change and was willing to accept an armistice that heretofore they didn't want. I didn't need to use them. So you ask the question, why didn't he use nuclear weapons? And the answer is simply because he got a better deal through an armistice than taking on the terrible burden of having expanded the war and killed hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of people through using atomic weapons.
So it was pretty transactional, you're saying.
I am saying that, and he was prepared. And in the case of, I think, the most dangerous moment in the Cold War, other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, was when the Chinese decided that they wanted to liberate Taiwan. And they planned to invade Taiwan in 1955 and again in 1958, or at least that's what it appeared they were doing. And they began to test American will, test American resolve. Would they really go to war to protect their Taiwanese ally? And Eisenhower made it very clear that he would, and that he would use nuclear weapons. Mind you, at that time, China didn't have a nuclear bomb, so it would have been a very one-sided affair. But I have no doubt, I have absolutely no doubt Eisenhower would have used nuclear weapons against China if the Chinese had invaded Taiwan. Okay,
let's shift to that challenge domestically that you were going to talk about in terms of tough decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure this is how Eisenhower would have answered the question. If you had said, Ike, what was your toughest decision on the home front? But what I take away from his story as president was that the toughest challenge for him related to civil rights. And I say that because Eisenhower didn't know much about civil rights when he became president. He did not understand the plight of African Americans in the United States when he became president. Your viewers are well read, and they will know of the horrible realities for Black Americans in the late Jim Crow era. which prevailed in the United States when Eisenhower became president. But to Eisenhower, that seemed normal. Jim Crow was the world that he had grown up in. So he had to learn on the job. And he learned not because he was intellectually curious about civil rights, but because civil rights came to him in a series of crises generated by civil rights activists and Black Americans all across the country who increasingly were pressing the case for change. So I think over the course of his 8 years, we see him confront or be confronted by a number of acute civil rights problems that he's not entirely sure how to resolve. We see him make progress in certain areas by, in the courts, especially the appointment of Earl Warren to the Supreme Court and the passage of Brown versus Board of Education, with which he had a very somewhat tense relationship, that decision. But it opened up, if you like, a kind of vector of change. And African Americans became more forward and they wanted to hasten the pace of change. And we see after Brown versus Board, the insistence on following the letter of the law that public school education should now be desegregated. And through the courts and through their own courageous actions, many African Americans wanted now to be able to send their children to public schools. As we know, all across the South, many schools resisted that. And so despite the 1954 Brown decision, the case that is emblematic of this whole story, but by no means the only case, is the Little Rock, Arkansas high school case. And that's an incredibly moving story that most of us are somewhat familiar with. But the story, the element of that I would just emphasize is Eisenhower was forced, not by his own desires, but by the actions of others, to confront the civil rights crisis at that moment in the fall of 1957, when 9 Black students insisted that they be allowed to attend the high school in their town, Little Rock, Arkansas, and they were turned away. They were turned away not by the school board, which had agreed to accept them into the school, but by the demagogic governor of the state, Orville Faubus, who insisted that sending Black students to Little Rock would create a mob mentality and would create such turmoil that it would be a terrible danger to everybody, so it was not allowed to happen. As we know, Eisenhower was confronted with a great crisis. Put simply, who rules? Do the states rule, or does the federal government rule?
And here's a small government conservative at heart president who believed in states' rights at some level.
Precisely. He believed deeply in states' rights. Not only that, he himself, in certain respects, was a Southerner.
Right.
And I say that using that term loosely, but this is a guy who had been born in Texas, who had spent many years in the Army, in Southern posts. Many of his best friends in the military were Southerners. And where, after all, did he go? To his most favorite watering hole was Augusta, Georgia, where he played golf at Augusta National. So Eisenhower was very sympathetic with the views of the white elite Southerners who said to him privately again and again and again, "We've got this. We understand race relations. We have it all figured out. There's no prejudice here. We know perfectly well what the Black community wants and what the white community wants. Everybody's happy. Go away."
Yeah, just be patient. Just be patient.
Ike was more or less happy to accept that on face value, but he was not able to avoid the great decision, or at least avoid the question that I've just posed. Who rules? Yeah. Can a Southern governor decide that the Supreme Court, the views of the Supreme Court, that the ruling of the Supreme Court does not apply to the state of Arkansas? Or must the president, as the chief law enforcement officer, enforce the laws of the land? Eisenhower didn't hesitate for a moment in answering that question. He said, "I rule as the president, and I have to protect the rule of law. And a district court ruling has determined that that school must be desegregated, or integrated." And so he sided, of course, with the students and sent in elements of the armed forces to ensure that those students were allowed to be admitted. I think it was gutsy in this sense, it cut against what he wanted, what he felt was what he was comfortable with. It put him in a very uncomfortable place, compelled him to do something that he knew was right, but which he feared might have a terrible consequence. And in that sense, I think a different president could easily have made a different decision and said, I don't really have a dog in this fight. I'm just going to kind of let this thing roll. And I give him credit for making a moral judgment in that case and using the power of the presidency to advance civil rights. But I hasten to say, he did not seek the opportunity to do so. It came to him. It forced him to move.
I'm looking at the clock here and shocked to realize that we've got, 10, 12 minutes left. I want to make the best use of our time. So I'm going to shift gears to something you're also very expert at. That's contemporary politics, and ask what you think President Trump might learn from reading your book. If you had to tweet to the president one or two sections of your book, what would they be, and what might he learn from them?
The first thing he'd learn is it's rather long. And that I don't know that he's a great reader of books, or even of long articles, for all I know.
Long tweets, right?
Yeah. Look, the truth is that although Eisenhower was president only, 7 decades ago, it feels as if we've lost the connective tissue between that time and today in terms of the expectations of politicians and of national leaders. One of the things that Eisenhower believed, he didn't always act this way, but often he did, is that the office of the presidency was genuinely supposed to be, at times, about uniting the country rather than dividing it by party. Of course, he was himself a partisan. He was a Republican. He led the party. But he was so eager to find common ground where he could with Democrats. He often did. His own party was cleft on certain issues, whether it was foreign policy or fear of communism or race relations. And so he was always looking to make common cause with Democrats if he could. But the main point is he set down his role as a party leader very frequently. Now, Donald Trump, of course, is inclined to do that too, because he never was really a member of a political party in a traditional sense. And I think even now he doesn't govern as the leader of a party. He governs principally as the leader of a family. The presidency is in the hands of a kind of a syndicate at the moment. It's not in the hands of a political party. But I guess if I was to tweet at him, I would say, remember, you're a national leader. And that the best thing you could do is to try to encourage citizens in the country who are deeply polarized to find some source of common ground. Whether that's at a very abstract level, i.e., we all believe democracy is a good thing, or at a concrete level, such as we do need a free press. And I'm a big enough man to take criticism from a free press because that's the world we live in. Politics is a grown-up sport. If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, etc. Although that's a Trumanism, so I wouldn't necessarily suggest that that comes from Eisenhower. But you get the idea. A few simple observations that that Eisenhower would relate to Trump is: don't think principally about yourself, but do think about the country. And that's just really is 5th grade civics. That's what the president is supposed to do.
President Trump's campaign theme was that he was going to make America great again. And there's, as you know, a parlor game among historians to try to name not only what year, but what month and what day he had in mind for American greatness. Most of us would place that day, month, or year in the 1950s. one of the really outstanding things about your book, Will, and one of the things that makes for a great biography, is you contextualize Ike's life so well. You give us such a good sense of the times. So I want to hear from you, having done that and learned that and done research on it. What was great about the 50s and what was not so great?
Well, I as a historian, of course, I tend to see the glass half empty. So, so I can very readily tell you some of the many things that made the 50s not so great. But I will say, before I get to that, that one of the things about the 1950s, especially the 8 Eisenhower years from 50, especially from 53, second half of 53 onward, was that for the first time in 20 years, Americans were neither at war or in a serious economic crisis. So just imagine any of us right now, imagine yourself at the tail end of 20 years of war and of economic dislocation, when you've lost a job, or you certainly know someone who lost a job, when you could not get basic food enough, clothing enough for your family, or when you had to leave and move from one part of the country to another in search of opportunities elsewhere, or when your father or your brother or your uncle or yourself had to put on a military uniform and go off to war, while on the home front, your mother and your aunt and your sister may also have put on a military uniform to go and serve their country on the home front. All I'm saying is 20 years of struggle and sacrifice came to an end with the end of the Korean War in 1953. And boy, were Americans ready for a change. And in that sense, we talk about the 50s with that glowing we assign it a kind of happiness, because it was not a time of struggle, death, sacrifice, and economic turmoil the way the previous 20 years had been. No wonder it still glows in our collective imagination. No wonder, because Americans were so happy to have the clouds of war and depression swept away. Negative, of course, are obvious. The Red Scare. I mean, McCarthyism was such a scourge. The anti-Semitism and anti-communism and xenophobia of the Red Scare were a terrible scourge on the first half of the decade, especially. And second, as I've alluded to, the civil rights problems of the country in the 50s were terrible. So if you're a Black American, there's no way the 50s looks like a great decade. It's a reminder of Jim Crow and of all of the struggles that still lay ahead in the 1960s. So America was still trying to figure itself out in the 50s, as it always is, even today.
Thank you, Will. I want to turn quickly to what it's like to write a book like this. Our viewers may not know, but you're a European historian. You're a historian of U.S. foreign relations. How do you end up writing a book, number one, about the United States? How do you end up writing a book about an American president, and why?
Well, it's true that I started out writing about Europe in my career, but I've always written about the middle part of the 20th century, and I've always looked at that century in terms of, I would say global, but especially a transatlantic perspective. So everything that I've done has really been about the era from the Second World War right up through the sort of the end of the 20th century. And there are quite a number of titanic figures who stride the globe in that period. One thinks of Churchill in Britain, or de Gaulle in France, certainly Roosevelt or John Kennedy, maybe. And there are some negative figures like a Nixon and so on. There are plenty of fascinating figures, but one can write different kinds of history, and I've written synthetic surveys that deal with a whole continent. But I think it was also a challenge for me to figure out, is it possible, if I wanted to write a biography of a leading figure, what would that be like? And what's it like to live with a person for so long? So I thought,
tell us, what's it like?
I mean, you get bored of them. Bottom line is, when you're done, you're like, that's it. Thanks. I'm done with that guy. Because of course you have to inhabit their world and figure out how they saw the world. And that's that's a challenge for historians because we don't usually like to be constrained by individual experience. We want to be able to see things at a much larger tapestry of actions and structures and ideas and ideologies. And writing a biography means you have to actually be loyal to the life that you're treating. And sometimes that felt like a straitjacket. One of the advantages of writing about a president, however, is that presidents see the world differently from an ordinary person, and they deal with such a diverse range of problems and challenges. So you can write almost a kind of world history through the lens of a president, because that's the way they exist, at least for the 8 years they're in the White House.
What would you like to say to your would-be readers out there, or just to our viewers, that you haven't said so far about Eisenhower? How would you like to close this interview?
I'll just start by saying that I came to Eisenhower as a really not knowing a great deal about what kind of man I would find. And I was pretty skeptical that I was going to find a lot of surprises. But what I did find was, for all of his limitations, and the book is full of its warts and all, there's all kinds of ways in which he failed or made bad decisions. What I found was that he surprised me again and again by having a very, I think, clear moral compass about what's right and what's wrong. He had for lack of a better word, a real sense of decency, of integrity. I admired him. I'm not saying I liked him. I found him at times very cold-blooded and distant. He could be a tough individual, but I do think when we think about our leaders, there's just one thing we should do as citizens, and that's have a degree of empathy with the fact they are human beings. They are trying often to do the best they can. I'm afraid I don't feel this way about Donald Trump, but I do feel this way about pretty much all of the post-war presidents, where I think they really genuinely believed they were trying to make the country better. They had very different ways of going about that, but Ike was certainly one of those people who worked tirelessly, gave his whole life to public service. And I just think that's a remarkable sacrifice that he made on behalf of the country that we ought to honor, even as we criticize our leaders, as we should, and hold them accountable.
William Hitchcock is the author of The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s. Will, thanks so much for this Facebook live stream, whatever we've just done. I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Always fun to be with you.
Okay. Now, Stefan, you need to show me how to save this. I'm afraid to hit anything.
Good question. You stopped the broadcast. That's good.
I didn't stop it yet. I was afraid to stop it.
Yeah, crap. Well, hopefully they can edit this.